Get her out of my house!" Jonathan Sterling grabbed Grace Thompson by the arm and shoved her toward the door. The billionaire's voice echoed through the marble hallway like thunder. Behind him, his fiancée smiled. But here's what Jonathan didn't know: the woman he just fired was the only person keeping his mother alive. And the woman he trusted. She was slowly poisoning her. This story will change how you see loyalty, power, and the price of silence. Before we begin, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. You don't want to miss what happens next. Jonathan Sterling had fired hundreds of people in his life. CEOs, vice presidents, board members who thought their position made them untouchable. He'd looked men in the eye and ended their careers without flinching. That was business. That was power. But he'd never fired someone in his own home. Not like this. "I said get out." Grace Thompson stood frozen in the doorway of the sitting room. Her hands were still trembling from what had just happened. 3 minutes ago, she'd been holding Margaret Sterling upright, keeping the old woman from choking on her own medication. Now she was being thrown out like garbage. "Mr. Sterling, please." "Don't." Jonathan held up his hand. "Don't say another word." Victoria Langley stepped forward, positioning herself perfectly between Jonathan and his mother. Her silk robe caught the lamplight. Her expression was pure concern, pure innocence. "Darling, I told you," Victoria said softly. "I've been warning you for weeks. She's been getting worse with your mother. Aggressive, careless." "That's not true," Grace said. "I saw it myself." Victoria continued, her voice rising just enough. "I walked in and she had Margaret halfway out of her wheelchair. The poor woman was terrified. She was choking." Grace's voice cracked. "The pills, something's wrong with her medication. She couldn't breathe. I was helping her." Victoria laughed. A small, pitying sound. "Helping her by dragging her around, by manhandling a 72-year-old woman." Jonathan looked at his mother. Margaret sat slumped in her wheelchair, her silver hair disheveled, her face pale and drawn. She looked confused, lost. Nothing like the sharp-minded woman who had raised him alone after his father died. Nothing like the former judge who had built a reputation on seeing through lies. "Mom," Jonathan said quietly. "What happened?" Margaret opened her mouth. Her lips trembled. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Grace was..." "She's confused, Jonathan." Victoria knelt beside the wheelchair, taking Margaret's hand with exaggerated gentleness. "The disease is affecting her cognition now. The doctor warned us this would happen." "I'm not confused." Margaret's voice grew slightly stronger. "Grace was helping me. The pills made me..." "Shh." Victoria stroked her hand. "It's okay. You don't have to protect her. She can't hurt you anymore." Grace felt something break inside her chest. 7 years. 7 years she'd worked in this house. She'd bathed Margaret when the aides didn't show up. She'd sat with her through sleepless nights when the pain was too much. She'd watched this woman deteriorate over the past 7 months and documented every single symptom because she knew something was wrong. And now she was being called a liar by a woman who'd been in this house for 18 months. "Mr. Sterling," Grace forced her voice to stay steady. "I've worked for your family for 7 years. I would never hurt your mother. Never." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Then explain what I just saw." "What you saw was me saving her life. She was choking. The medication she's been taking, it's not helping her. It's making her worse. Every day she's getting weaker. Every day she's more confused. That's not the disease. That's the pills." Victoria stood up slowly. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you a doctor, Grace?" "No, but I..." "Are you a nurse?" "I was a nurse's aide for 12 years before I..." "A nurse's aide." Victoria turned to Jonathan. "She's a maid, darling. She cleans toilets and changes sheets. And now she's diagnosing your mother's medication, overruling actual physicians." I'm not overruling anyone. I'm telling you what I've observed. What you've observed. Victoria's voice dripped with contempt. From your vast medical expertise. Jonathan raised his hand. Enough. The room fell silent. He looked at Grace. Really looked at her. The woman who had been part of his household since before his first startup went public. The woman his mother had always trusted. But trust was a funny thing. It could blind you just as easily as it could guide you. Grace, he said slowly, I appreciate your years of service, but I can't have someone in my home who puts my mother at risk. Whatever you think you saw, whatever you think is happening, you're not qualified to make that judgment. Sir, my fiancée is here every day. She quit her job to take care of my mother. She has no reason to lie to me. Grace looked at Victoria. Something passed between them. A recognition. Grace saw it clearly now, the calculation behind those sympathetic eyes. The patience of a predator. And what reason would I have to lie? Grace asked quietly. Victoria smiled. I don't know, Grace. You tell me. Maybe you're bitter about your position. Maybe you wanted more money. Maybe you just don't like seeing another woman take care of the person you considered yours. She is mine. The words came out before Grace could stop them. Mrs. Sterling is like family to me. I would die before I let anything happen to her. How dramatic. Victoria turned to Jonathan. Darling, I think we've heard enough. Jonathan nodded slowly. Security will escort you out. You have 1 hour to pack your things. Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Please, she whispered. Just listen to me. Just for 1 minute. Something is wrong in this house. Your mother, she wasn't this sick 7 months ago. She was slower, yes. She forgot things sometimes. But she was herself. She recognized people. She could hold conversations. Now she barely knows where she is half the time. Jonathan's expression flickered, just for a moment. Victoria noticed. The disease progresses, Grace. Victoria's voice was gentle now, understanding. You've seen it happen. The doctors explained it. Some patients decline rapidly. It's heartbreaking, but it's natural. It's not natural. Grace's voice rose. I've seen dementia. I worked with dementia patients for 12 years. This is different. This is you refusing to accept reality. Victoria's patience finally cracked just slightly. You're a maid. You cook. You clean. You follow instructions. You don't diagnose. You don't question. You do your job, or you did, until you started forgetting your place. The words hung in the air. Grace looked at Jonathan. His face was closed, decided. 1 hour, he repeated. Leave your keys with security. The guards arrived in 8 minutes. Grace didn't fight. What would be the point? She was a 55-year-old black woman accusing a wealthy white socialite of... what exactly? She had no proof, no credentials, no allies. All she had was a notebook hidden in her locker. 212 days of observations, symptoms, dosages, reactions. Everything she'd noticed since Victoria Langley moved into the house. She'd started writing things down on day 31. That was when she first noticed Margaret's hands shaking in a way they hadn't before. When the vomiting started after evening medications. When the confusion began creeping in at odd hours. Grace had mentioned it to Victoria once early on. I'll talk to her doctor, Victoria had said with a reassuring smile. Thank you for being so attentive. Nothing changed. The symptoms got worse. Grace mentioned it again and again. The third time, Victoria's smile had sharpened. Grace, I understand you care about Margaret, but you need to trust the medical professionals. They know what they're doing, and frankly, it's not appropriate for household staff to second-guess medical decisions. After that, Grace stopped talking. She started writing instead. The security guards walked her to the staff quarters. Grace packed mechanically clothed toiletries, the photograph of her late husband, the Bible her grandmother had given her 40 years ago. She retrieved the notebook last. It was hidden in a false bottom of her locker, underneath a stack of old magazines. She'd learned that trick from her father, who had grown up in Mississippi, during a time when black folks had to hide everything that mattered. She slipped the notebook into her coat lining. At the service entrance, she paused. One of the guards, Raymond, a quiet man she'd known for years, looked at her with something like sympathy. "I'm sorry, Grace. I don't understand what happened." "Neither do I, Raymond." She took a breath. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Watch Mrs. Sterling, please. If something seems wrong, if she gets worse." "Grace." Raymond glanced toward the house. "I can't get involved." "I know. I'm just asking you to watch." He didn't answer. Grace stepped outside. The October air hit her face sharp and cold. The sun was setting behind the mansion, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. She had arrived at this house 7 years ago, with nothing but a reference letter and a determination to rebuild her life after Marcus died. The Sterlings had given her a job when no one else would. Margaret had treated her with kindness and respect. Jonathan had been distant but fair. And now she was walking away with a suitcase and a notebook full of accusations she couldn't prove. Behind her, Victoria Langley watched from an upstairs window. That night, Victoria prepared Margaret's evening medication with special care. The old woman sat in her wheelchair by the bed, eyes half closed. She'd been sleeping more and more lately. The doctors said it was the disease. Victoria knew better. "Time for your pills, Margaret." Margaret's eyes opened slightly. "Where's Grace?" "She's gone, dear. Remember, she had to leave." "Why?" "Because she wasn't taking care of you properly." Victoria handed her a glass of water and 4 pills. "Here, these will help you sleep." Margaret looked at the pills in her palm. Her brow furrowed. "Something's wrong." "What do you mean?" "These pills. They make me sick. They make me forget things." Victoria's smile tightened. "The doctors prescribed them, Margaret. They know what's best." Grace said, "Grace is gone." Victoria's voice hardened for just a moment, then softened again. "And she wasn't a doctor. She was just a maid, Margaret. She didn't understand your condition." Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Something flickered behind those faded blue eyes. A spark of the judge she used to be. The woman who had spent 30 years reading people, detecting lies, delivering verdicts. Then it faded. The confusion returned. She took the pills. Victoria watched her swallow, then helped her into bed. "Sleep well, Margaret. Tomorrow is another day." She turned off the light and walked to the door. In the darkness, she allowed herself a small smile. The maid was gone. The son was oblivious. The mother was getting weaker every day. Everything was going according to plan. Across town, Grace sat in a bus station, her suitcase at her feet. She had $847 in her checking account. No family nearby. A sister in Atlanta who had her own problems. A son in the military overseas who called when he could but couldn't help from 8,000 miles away. She was 55 years old, unemployed, and sitting in a Greyhound station at 9 o'clock at night. And somewhere in that mansion, Margaret Sterling was dying. Grace was certain of it now. Not from disease, from something far more deliberate. She pulled out the notebook and opened it to the last entry. Day 212. Victoria gave M her evening pills at 7:15 p.m. M vomited at 7:45 p.m. Tremors began at 8:30 p.m. M could not remember her son's name by 9 p.m. This is not dementia. This is poisoning. Grace stared at the words. She had no proof, no credentials, no money to hire lawyers or investigators. But she had her eyes. She had her notes. And she had 25 years of working with sick and elderly people, enough experience to know the difference between a disease that kills slowly and a person who kills deliberately. The question was, what could she do about it? She closed the notebook and looked up at the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Her grandmother's voice came back to her from 40 years ago. "Grace, when you see wrong happening and you stay quiet, You become part of the wrong. God didn't give you eyes to close them. Grace had closed her eyes for too long already. She'd documented everything, but she hadn't acted. She'd been afraid. Afraid of losing her job. Afraid of not being believed. Afraid of going up against people with money and power and lawyers. Now she'd lost the job anyway. And if she didn't act, Margaret Sterling would be dead within months. Maybe weeks. Grace was sure of it. She stood up and walked to the payphone by the restrooms. She didn't have many options, but she had one name, one person who might listen. Helen Carter, a retired nurse she'd worked with 15 years ago at Mercy General. Helen had always been sharp, skeptical, willing to fight when she believed something was wrong. Grace dialed the number from memory. It rang 4 times. 5, 6. Hello? Helen's voice was groggy, annoyed. Helen, it's Grace. Grace Thompson. I'm sorry to call so late. A pause. Grace. My God, it's been years. What's wrong? Grace took a breath. I need your help. There's a woman being poisoned and no one believes me. And if I don't do something, she's going to die. Back at the mansion, Jonathan Sterling sat in his study staring at nothing. The confrontation kept replaying in his mind. Grace's face when he told her to leave, the desperation in her voice, the way she'd looked at Victoria not with anger, but with something closer to fear. Something is wrong in this house. He shook his head. Grace was upset. She'd worked here for years and was being let go. Of course she would say anything to stay, but her words kept echoing. Your mother wasn't this sick 7 months ago. She was slower, yes, but she was herself. Was that true? Jonathan tried to remember. Before Victoria moved in, his mother had been, what? Forgetful, yes. Slower to recall names. But she'd still played chess with him on Sunday afternoons. She'd still argued with him about politics. She'd still been Margaret Sterling, sharp-tongued, observant, impossible to fool. When had that changed? He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. It had been gradual. So gradual, he hadn't noticed until suddenly his mother was a stranger. A hollow version of herself. The disease progresses, Victoria had explained. Some patients decline rapidly. That made sense. The doctors had confirmed it. Everyone agreed. Everyone except Grace. Jonathan walked to the window and looked out at the darkened grounds. The security lights cast pale circles across the lawn. Somewhere out there, a woman he'd just fired was probably cursing his name. He should feel relieved. Victoria said Grace was dangerous. The situation was handled. So why did he feel like he'd just made a terrible mistake? The phone in his pocket buzzed. A text from Victoria. Your mother is sleeping. I gave her the medication. Everything under control. Coming to bed soon. Love you. Jonathan typed back. Thanks. Be there in a minute. He put the phone away and stood in the darkness for a long time. Tomorrow, he would have a meeting with his CFO. Then lunch with investors. Then a flight to Chicago for a tech conference. His life was scheduled down to the minute, every day controlled and optimized for maximum efficiency. Somewhere in all that optimization, he'd stopped paying attention to the things that mattered. His mother was dying, and he wasn't sure anymore if he understood why. 3 floors above Margaret Sterling lay awake in the darkness. The pills made her foggy, but tonight something was different. A small part of her mind refused to surrender to the chemical haze. It kept circling back to the same thoughts like a dog worrying a bone. Grace was gone. Grace who had been with them for 7 years. Grace who made her tea exactly the way she liked it. Grace who sat with her during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. Grace who had looked at her with such concern these past months. The pills, Grace had said. Something's wrong with the pills. Margaret lifted her hand in the darkness. It trembled visibly, even in the dim light from the window. That was new. That had started. When? A few months ago. 6 months. 7. Around the time Victoria arrived, Margaret's foggy mind tried to make connections. It was like grasping at smoke. Every time she got close to a thought, it dissolved. But one thing remained: solid fear. She was afraid of Victoria. She couldn't remember exactly why, couldn't articulate it even to herself. But when Victoria entered the room, Margaret felt something cold in her stomach, something instinctive, primal. The feeling a prey animal has when a predator enters its territory. Margaret closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow, she would try to talk to Jonathan. She would find the words. She would make him understand. If she could just remember. If the fog would just lift for a moment. The pills. She shouldn't take the pills. That thought crystallized in her mind, like ice forming on a window. She held on to it desperately, knowing it would try to slip away. Don't take the pills. Don't trust Victoria. Find Grace. The thoughts circled and circled, until finally, mercifully, sleep pulled her under. At midnight, Victoria slipped out of bed and walked barefoot through the silent mansion. Jonathan was asleep. He always slept deeply, the sleep of a man who believed his world was under control. She padded down the hallway to the small office she'd claimed as her own. Inside, locked in the bottom drawer of her desk, were the supplies she needed. A small amber vial, unmarked, untraceable. Victoria held it up to the moonlight streaming through the window. The liquid inside was clear, colorless, harmless looking. But it wasn't harmless. She'd been dosing Margaret for 7 months now, small amounts at first mixed into her legitimate medications. Enough to cause symptoms that mimicked dementia. Enough to make her confused, weak, dependent. The doctors never questioned it. Why would they? They expected an elderly woman to decline. They saw what they expected to see. And Jonathan. He saw even less. He saw his mother fading and accepted it as natural. Inevitable. Just another item on his agenda to manage. Victoria smiled in the darkness. It had been so easy. The only problem had been Grace. That woman noticed everything. She asked questions. She wrote things down in that little notebook she thought no one knew about. Victoria had searched for that notebook a dozen times. Never found it. But it didn't matter now. Grace was gone. Whatever she'd written was worthless, the observations of a maid easily dismissed. Tomorrow, Victoria would increase the dosage slightly. Not enough to raise suspicion. Just enough to accelerate the timeline. Margaret Sterling had perhaps 2 months left. Maybe 3. And then everything she had, the mansion, the investments, the Sterling name, would belong to Victoria. All she had to do was wait. And keep pouring the pills. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat in Helen Carter's small kitchen until 3 in the morning, spreading her notebook pages across the table like evidence in a trial. Helen studied each entry with the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent 40 years in nursing, 30 of them in geriatric care. Day 31, Helen read aloud. Patient began experiencing hand tremors not previously observed. Tremors increase after evening medication. She flipped the page. Day 47. Patient vomited twice after morning pills. Complained of burning sensation in chest and throat. Grace wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. I started documenting everything after the first month. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't name it. Helen kept reading. Her frown deepened with each page. Day 89. Patient failed to recognize her own son for approximately 2 hours following afternoon medication. Confusion cleared partially by evening. Helen looked up. This pattern, the symptoms spiking after medication, then partially clearing, that's not how dementia works. I know. Dementia is progressive. It doesn't come and go based on when someone takes their pills. I know, Grace repeated. But I'm not a doctor. I'm not even a nurse. I'm just a maid who cleans toilets and changes sheets. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. Helen closed the notebook. Who said that to you? Victoria, the fiancée. right before I was fired. Tell me about her. Grace took a breath. Where did she even begin? She showed up 18 months ago. Jonathan met her at some charity gala, the kind where rich people pay $10,000 a plate to feel good about themselves. Within 3 months, she'd moved into the mansion. Within 6, she'd quit her job to take care of Margaret full-time. That's fast. Too fast. But Jonathan didn't see it that way. He was grateful. He travels constantly for work sometimes 3-4 weeks at a time. Having someone at home to watch his mother was a relief. Helen leaned back in her chair. And when did Margaret start declining? Grace closed her eyes, trying to pinpoint the moment. It was gradual at first, little things. She'd forget where she put her reading glasses. She'd call me by her late sister's name sometimes. But that was normal. She was 72. Some forgetfulness is expected. When did it become more than forgetfulness? About 7 months ago, right around the time Victoria started managing her medications. Helen's expression sharpened. Victoria gives her the pills. Not a nurse, not a home health aide. She dismissed the home health aide after 2 months, said the woman was upsetting Margaret. Then she canceled the visiting nurse, said Margaret needed rest, not constant medical intrusion. So Victoria is the only one administering medication. The only one. She guards those pills like they're made of gold. I offered to help once, just to give her a break, and she nearly bit my head off. Said Margaret's care was too important to delegate to household staff. Helen was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to her bookshelf, pulling down a thick medical reference guide. The symptoms you've documented, she said, flipping through pages. Tremors, vomiting, confusion, burning sensations in the chest and throat. These are consistent with several things: medication interactions, overdose, or what? Helen set the book down. Poisoning. The word hung in the air between them. I thought so too, Grace said quietly. But I didn't want to believe it. Why not? Because if I'm right, that woman has been slowly killing Margaret Sterling for 7 months, and I documented every single day of it without doing a damn thing to stop her. Helen reached across the table and gripped Grace's hand. You tried. You raised concerns. You were ignored. I should have tried harder. You tried as hard as you could without proof, and now you're here at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning trying to find that proof. Helen squeezed her hand. That's not nothing, Grace. That's everything. Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. So what do we do? Helen pulled the notebook toward her again. First, we need to understand exactly what's happening to Margaret. These symptoms, if I'm reading them right, suggest some kind of toxic substance being introduced gradually, something that mimics neurological decline. Like what? There are dozens of possibilities, certain heavy metals, some prescription drugs in the wrong doses, even some over-the-counter medications if they're combined incorrectly. Helen tapped the notebook. But we can't prove anything without blood work. Current blood work, not the stuff her doctors have already seen. How do we get that I can't exactly walk back into the mansion and ask for a blood sample? Helen thought for a moment. Does Margaret have any appointments coming up? Any doctor visits? Grace tried to remember. She used to see her neurologist every month, but Victoria started spacing out the appointments, said they were too stressful for Margaret. Of course she did. Helen's voice was grim. Less medical oversight means less chance of someone catching on. So we're stuck. Maybe not. Helen pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. I still know some people at Mercy General, and I know someone at the county health department who owes me a favor. Let me make some calls in the morning. Grace nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. Even if we get proof, even if we can show that Margaret is being poisoned, who's going to believe us? Victoria has Jonathan completely fooled. The doctors see what they expect to see, and I'm just... Stop. Helen's voice was firm. Stop saying what you're not. I don't care if you're a maid or a CEO. You saw something wrong and you documented it. That makes you a witness. That makes you credible. Not to Jonathan Sterling. Then we'll find someone else. Someone who has to listen. Grace stared at the notebook. 212 days of watching a woman fade away. 212 days of feeling helpless. She's running out of time, Helen. I can feel it. Whatever Victoria is giving her, it's getting stronger. The symptoms are accelerating. Then we need to move fast. The next morning, Grace took a bus to the pharmacy where Margaret's prescriptions were filled. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but Helen had given her a list of questions to ask, ways to gather information without arousing suspicion. The pharmacy was small, tucked between a dry cleaner and a nail salon in a strip mall 15 minutes from the Sterling estate. Grace had picked up medications here dozens of times over the years. She recognized the pharmacist, a middle-aged man named David, who had always been friendly. "Mrs. Thompson." He smiled when she approached the counter. "Haven't seen you in a while. Picking up for Mrs. Sterling." Grace shook her head. "No, I'm not working for the family anymore." David's smile faltered. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." "It's all right. Things change." Grace hesitated. "Actually, I was wondering if I could ask you something. Off the record." David glanced around the empty store. "Sure. What's on your mind?" "Mrs. Sterling's medications. Have they changed recently?" "I can't discuss patient information, you know that." "I'm not asking for specifics. Just, has the routine changed? Different pickup times, different combinations." David's expression grew uncomfortable. "Grace, I really can't." "She's sick, David. Really sick. And I think something is wrong with her medications. Please, anything you can tell me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The fiancé picks up the prescriptions now. Started about 6 months ago." "I know that part." "What you might not know is that she's been refilling some medications earlier than the schedule allows. I flagged it twice, but she had authorization from the prescribing doctor. Said the dosages were being adjusted." Grace's heart beat faster. "Which medications?" "I can't tell you that, but I can tell you that one of them is commonly used for sleep. And at the doses being picked up, it would be a lot, more than standard. Enough to cause symptoms, confusion, memory loss, tremors." David's face went pale. "Grace, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just asking questions." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he straightened up. "I think you should leave now. And I think you should talk to a doctor. A real doctor. One who isn't already involved with Mrs. Sterling's care." "David, I've said too much already. Please go." Grace left the pharmacy with more questions than answers. But she had learned one thing: Victoria was manipulating the prescriptions. Somehow, she was getting higher doses than Margaret needed. And she was using them for something the doctors hadn't authorized. The question was, how could Grace prove it? 3 days later, Grace got her chance. Helen's contact at the county health department had come through. A surprise inspection of the Sterling household was scheduled based on an anonymous complaint about elder care concerns. "It's not much," Helen warned her. "They'll check on Margaret's living conditions, ask some questions about her care routine, but they're not authorized to take blood samples or access medical records without cause." "Then what's the point?" "The point is getting fresh eyes on her. Someone who isn't already invested in believing Victoria's story. If the inspector sees something concerning, they can escalate." Grace nodded. "When is it happening?" "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. "Will they tell Victoria in advance?" Helen smiled grimly. "That's the best part. They don't have to. Surprise inspections are standard procedure when there's a credible complaint." For the first time in days, Grace felt something like hope. The inspection did not go as planned. Grace learned the details later, pieced together from Helen's contacts and news reports. Victoria had answered the door with perfect composure, welcoming the inspector with gracious concern. "Of course, come in. I'm so glad someone is taking Margaret's care seriously. I've been worried myself." She had given the inspector a tour of the house, Margaret's bedroom, the medication storage, the daily care logs she meticulously maintained. Everything was pristine, organized, professional. Margaret herself was having a good day. Her confusion was minimal. Her tremors were barely noticeable. She smiled at the inspector and said, "Yes, Victoria takes wonderful care of me. I don't know what I'd do without her." The inspector left after 2 hours, satisfied that no intervention was needed. When Grace heard the news, she wanted to scream. She knew. Grace said to Helen that night. Victoria knew the inspection was coming. She adjusted the medication, made sure Margaret would seem coherent. How could she have known it was supposed to be a surprise? Someone tipped her off, or she's just that careful. She probably adjusts the doses based on what's happening each day, higher when there's no oversight, lower when she needs Margaret to perform. Helen shook her head slowly. That's incredibly calculated. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone. This woman isn't careless. She isn't making mistakes. Every single thing she does is deliberate. So what do we do now? Grace stared at the wall thinking, I need to get back into that house. Helen's eyes widened. Grace, that's insane. You were fired. They'll have you arrested for trespassing. Not if I'm careful. I still have my old service entrance key. And I know the security rotation. Raymond works nights on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He's sympathetic. He might look the other way. Might is a big gamble. Margaret is dying, Helen. Every day I wait is another day Victoria has to finish what she started. Helen was quiet for a long time. Then she sighed. What exactly are you planning to do? I hid copies of my documentation in my old locker. I need to retrieve them. And while I'm there, I'm going to get into Victoria's room and find whatever she's using to poison Margaret. That's breaking and entering. I prefer to think of it as rescuing evidence. Helen almost laughed. Almost. And if you're caught, Grace looked at her steadily. Then I'm caught. But at least I'll know I tried everything. The following Tuesday, Grace waited until midnight. The Sterling estate was quiet. Most of the lights were off except for the security stations and the soft glow from the master bedroom on the 3rd floor. Grace approached from the east side of the property, where the old service entrance was hidden behind a row of hedges. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain someone would hear it. The key still worked. She slipped inside and stood perfectly still, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. The laundry room smelled like detergent and fabric softener, familiar scents that made her chest ache with unexpected grief. 7 years. She had spent 7 years walking these halls. Now she was creeping through them like a thief. She found her old locker in the staff area. The combination lock was still there exactly as she'd left it. Inside, hidden beneath a stack of old magazines, was the envelope containing copies of her documentation. Grace tucked it into her coat and turned toward the main house. Getting to Victoria's room was riskier. She had to cross the main hallway, avoid the motion sensors near the staircase, and time her movements around the security cameras. She knew the blind spots. She had watched Raymond adjust the cameras months ago, when Victoria complained about privacy concerns. The irony was not lost on her. Victoria's private office was on the 2nd floor next to the guest suite she had claimed as her own when she first moved in. The door was unlocked. Victoria had no reason to expect intruders in her own home. Grace slipped inside and pulled out her flashlight, keeping the beam low. The office was immaculate. A mahogany desk, leather chairs, bookshelves lined with volumes that looked like they'd never been opened. Victoria had expensive taste and the means to indulge it, courtesy of Jonathan Sterling. Grace started with the desk drawers, papers, notebooks, receipts. Nothing incriminating. She moved to the filing cabinet. Locked. Her heart sank. She didn't have the tools or the time to break it open. Then she noticed something, a small key on a chain hanging from a hook behind the door, hidden in plain sight. Grace grabbed it and tried the cabinet. It opened. Inside were files, dozens of them. Insurance documents, legal papers, investment summaries. And at the very bottom, a locked metal box. The key didn't fit the box. Grace tried to pry it open, but it held firm. A sound in the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Coming closer. Grace shoved the files back into place, closed the cabinet, and ducked behind the desk. She pressed herself against the wood, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Silence. Then Victoria's voice speaking to someone on the phone. "No, everything is under control. The inspection was handled. Jonathan suspects nothing." A pause. "Yes, I increased the dosage tonight. She'll have another bad episode tomorrow. That should keep everyone focused on her decline, not asking questions." Grace's blood turned to ice. "How much longer?" "A few more weeks, maybe a month. I don't want to rush it. That's how people get caught." Another pause. Victoria laughed softly. "Don't worry. By the time anyone realizes what happened, I'll be Mrs. Jonathan Sterling. And Margaret will be just another tragic case of elderly decline." The footsteps moved away down the hall. Grace stayed frozen behind the desk for a full 5 minutes, her mind racing. She had heard it. Victoria's own voice admitting everything. But a phone conversation wasn't proof. It was hearsay. She needed something tangible, something that would hold up when she went to the police. The metal box. Grace turned back to the filing cabinet. She couldn't open the box, but she could take it. It was small enough to fit in her coat. Heavy, but manageable. She grabbed it and moved toward the door, listening for any sound in the hallway. Silence. She made it back through the house, out the service entrance, and into the cold night air without encountering anyone. As she walked away from the estate, the weight of the metal box pressed against her chest like a second heartbeat. Whatever was inside, Grace knew it would change everything. Helen examined the box under the bright lights of her kitchen. It's a basic lockbox, fireproof. You can buy them at any office supply store. She turned it over in her hands. "The lock is standard. I might be able to pick it." "You know how to pick locks." Helen smiled grimly. "I raised 3 teenage sons. You learn things." 20 minutes later, the lock clicked open. Grace held her breath as Helen lifted the lid. Inside were several items. A small amber vial filled with clear liquid. A syringe still in its sterile packaging. Printed pages that looked like medical research. And a handwritten list of dates with corresponding dosage numbers. Helen picked up the vial, carefully reading the label. "This is a sedative. Prescription strength. In the right dose, it helps people sleep. In the wrong dose, it causes confusion," Grace finished. "Memory loss, tremors, all the symptoms Margaret has been showing." "Exactly." Helen set the vial down. Combined with her regular medications, this would create a cumulative toxic effect. The doctors would see symptoms consistent with dementia. They'd have no reason to suspect anything else. "And the dates?" Helen examined the handwritten list. "These match your documentation almost perfectly. Look, day 47 increased dosage. Day 89 doubled evening amount. She's been tracking it herself. This is practically a confession." Grace sank into a chair, the adrenaline draining from her body. "We have it," she said quietly. "We actually have proof." "We have evidence," Helen corrected. "But we need more. This vial could be dismissed as something she uses for herself. The dates could be explained away as medication management. For this to stick, we need current blood work from Margaret showing toxic levels of this sedative. And we need someone with authority to take action. The police. Eventually. But first, we need to get to Jonathan Sterling." Grace shook her head. "He won't believe me. He threw me out of his house." "Then we make him believe. We show him the evidence. We explain what we found. And if he still refuses to listen..." Helen paused. "Then we go to the police ourselves. Let them sort it out. Grace looked at the contents of the metal box spread across the table. 7 months of suspicion validated in a handful of objects. When? She asked. Tomorrow. I'll make some calls tonight, find out Jonathan's schedule. We'll catch him somewhere public, somewhere Victoria can't interfere. Grace nodded slowly. And if this doesn't work? Helen met her eyes. Then we've done everything we can. The rest is up to people with more power than us. That night, Grace lay awake in Helen's spare bedroom, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Margaret, the woman who had treated her like family for 7 years. The sharp-minded judge who had become a confused shell of herself. The victim who didn't even know she needed saving. She thought about Jonathan the billionaire who trusted the wrong woman and ignored the right one. The son who was about to learn the terrible truth about the person he planned to marry. And she thought about Victoria, the predator who had calculated every move, played every angle, fooled everyone around her. The monster who smiled while she poisoned. Tomorrow, everything would change, one way or another. Grace closed her eyes and prayed for the strength to finish what she'd started. 2 floors above the Sterling kitchen, Margaret Sterling woke from a nightmare she couldn't remember. Her head throbbed. Her hands trembled. Her mouth tasted like metal and ash. She lay in the darkness trying to gather her scattered thoughts. Something was wrong. She had known that for months. She just couldn't hold on to the knowledge. It kept slipping away, like water through her fingers. The pills. Someone had told her about the pills. Someone had warned her. Grace. The name surfaced from the fog, clear and bright. Grace had warned her. Grace had said the medication was wrong. Grace had tried to help. And now Grace was gone. Margaret pushed herself upright, fighting the wave of dizziness that threatened to pull her back down. She needed to think. She needed to remember. Victoria gave her the pills. Victoria controlled everything: the doctors, the schedules, the information that reached Jonathan. Victoria. Margaret's hands clenched the bedsheets. She had spent 30 years as a judge reading people, detecting lies, delivering justice. That skill hadn't vanished completely. It was just buried under layers of chemical fog. And right now, in this moment of clarity, Margaret knew the truth. Victoria was killing her. The realization should have been terrifying. Instead, it was almost a relief. At least she wasn't crazy. At least there was a reason for everything that had been happening. The question was, what could she do about it? She was weak, confused most of the time, dependent on the very woman who was poisoning her. But she wasn't helpless. Not yet. Margaret reached for the glass of water on her nightstand. Next to it sat the bottle of evening pills Victoria had left for her. She picked up the bottle and turned it over in her hands. "Don't take the pills." The thought crystallized in her mind. If the pills were what was making her sick, then not taking them would help her recover. At least temporarily. At least enough to think clearly. Margaret opened the bottle and poured the pills into her palm. Then, slowly, deliberately, she dropped them one by one into the decorative plant beside her bed. Tomorrow she would pretend to be just as confused as always. She would play the role Victoria expected. But inside, she would be watching, waiting, gathering strength. And when the moment was right, she would find a way to save herself, or die trying. The next morning came cold and gray. Grace dressed carefully in the only professional outfit she still owned, a navy blue dress she had bought for her husband's funeral 3 years ago. She looked at herself in Helen's bathroom mirror and saw a woman who had aged a decade in the past 2 weeks. "You don't have to do this alone," Helen said from the doorway. "I can come with you." "No. If I show up with backup, Jonathan will think I'm staging something. I need to face him myself. And if he refuses to listen..." Grace picked up her bag, which contained the metal box and all of her documentation. "Then I go to the police. But I have to try this first. He deserves to hear the truth from someone who was there." Helen handed her a slip of paper. "His schedule. He has a meeting at the Meridian Hotel at 11. That's a public place. Victoria won't be there. It's your best chance to get him alone." Grace took the paper and folded it carefully into her pocket. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when Margaret is safe and that woman is behind bars." Grace arrived at the Meridian Hotel at 10:30. She found a seat in the lobby where she could watch the main entrance without being conspicuous. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited. Every time the door opened, she tensed, expecting to see Jonathan's familiar face. At 10:50, he walked in. Jonathan Sterling looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, and his shoulders carried a tension that spoke of sleepless nights. He was on his phone speaking quickly to someone about quarterly projections and market analysis. Grace stood up before she could lose her nerve. "Mr. Sterling." He stopped mid-stride. His expression went from confused to cold in less than a second. "Grace, what are you doing here?" "I need to speak with you. Please. 5 minutes." "I don't have 5 minutes, and I don't have anything to say to you." He started to walk past her. Grace stepped into his path. "Your mother is being poisoned." Jonathan froze. "What did you say?" "Victoria is poisoning your mother. Slowly. Deliberately. That's why she's been getting sicker. That's why her symptoms don't match normal dementia. I have proof." Jonathan's face hardened. "This is insane. You're insane." "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the evidence." Grace reached into her bag and pulled out the metal box. "This was hidden in Victoria's office. I found it 2 nights ago." "You broke into my house. I found the vial she's been using, the syringes, the dosage records. It's all here, Mr. Sterling. Everything you need to see." Jonathan stared at the box like it might bite him. "You expect me to believe that my fiancée, the woman who quit her job to take care of my mother, is secretly poisoning her. I expect you to look at the evidence and decide for yourself. This is harassment. I could have you arrested. Then have me arrested. But look at the evidence first." Something in Grace's voice made him pause. Maybe it was the steadiness. Maybe it was the complete absence of desperation. She wasn't begging anymore. She was simply presenting the truth and waiting for him to see it. 5 minutes, he said finally. Then I'm calling security. They sat in a quiet corner of the hotel restaurant, the metal box on the table between them. Grace opened it and laid out the contents one by one. The amber vial, the syringes, the printed research on sedative toxicity, the handwritten dosage log. "This vial contains a prescription sedative," she explained. "In normal doses, it helps people sleep. In the doses Victoria has been giving your mother, it causes confusion, memory loss, tremors, and cognitive decline. Combined with Margaret's regular medications, it creates a toxic buildup that mimics dementia." Jonathan picked up the vial, turning it over in his hands. His expression was unreadable. "And these dates?" He gestured to the handwritten log. "Victoria's own records. She tracked every dosage increase. Look at day 47, that's when your mother started vomiting after meals. Day 89, that's when she stopped recognizing you for hours at a time. Every symptom your mother has experienced corresponds directly to a dosage change." "How do you know this?" "You're not a doctor." "No, but I am a woman who spent 12 years working with elderly patients before I came to your house. I know what dementia looks like, and I know what poisoning looks like. Your mother's symptoms never made sense to me. They came and went too quickly. They spiked at predictable times. They responded to patterns that had nothing to do with disease and everything to do with medication." Jonathan set the vial down. His hands were trembling slightly. "Why would Victoria do this?" "Money, power, control, take your pick." Grace leaned forward. "She's been isolating your mother for months. She fired the home health aide. She canceled the visiting nurse. She manages all the medications herself and refuses to let anyone else help. Every decision she's made has been designed to give her more control over Margaret's care and reduce the chance that anyone would notice what she was doing. But the doctors, The doctors see what they expect to see. An elderly woman with declining health, progressive dementia. It's a common story. They have no reason to suspect anything else, especially when Victoria is there at every appointment performing the role of devoted caregiver. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't want to believe this. I know, but that doesn't make it less true. He looked up at her, and Grace saw something she hadn't expected, not anger or denial, but anguish. The anguish of a man whose entire world was cracking beneath his feet. I loved her, he said. I was going to marry her. I know. And you're telling me she's been murdering my mother in front of my eyes. Not murdering, not yet. Killing slowly, making it look natural. By the time Margaret dies, everyone will believe it was the disease. No one will suspect anything. Jonathan pressed his hands against his forehead. God. Oh, God. There's still time, Grace said quietly. Your mother is still alive, but she won't be for much longer if Victoria continues what she's doing. What do I do? Take your mother to a hospital. Get independent blood work. If what I'm telling you is true, the tests will show toxic levels of sedatives in her system. Then you call the police and show them what's in this box. Jonathan stared at the evidence scattered across the table, the vial, the syringes, the damning log of dates and doses. And if you're wrong, Grace met his eyes steadily. Then I'm a crazy woman who broke into your house and stole your fiancé's property. You can press charges and I'll go to jail. But if I'm right, Mr. Sterling, your mother has maybe weeks to live. And every day you wait is another day Victoria has to finish what she started. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Jonathan gathered the contents back into the metal box and stood. I need to think about this. Don't think too long. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Why are you doing this? I fired you. I humiliated you in front of my entire household. Why do you care what happens to my mother? Grace stood and picked up her bag. Because your mother treated me like family when the rest of the world treated me like furniture. Because she's a good woman who doesn't deserve to die at the hands of someone she trusted. And because when you see something wrong happening and you stay quiet, you become part of the wrong. She paused. My grandmother told me that when I was 15 years old. I've never forgotten it. Jonathan was silent. I'll be at this number if you need me. Grace handed him a slip of paper with Helen's phone number. Don't take too long, Mr. Sterling. Your mother doesn't have much time left. She walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Jonathan drove home in a daze. The metal box sat on the passenger seat beside him, its weight somehow greater than its actual size. He kept glancing at it, as if expecting it to disappear to prove that the last hour had been some kind of hallucination. But it stayed solid, real, undeniable. When he pulled into the mansion's driveway, Victoria was waiting at the front door. She smiled as he got out of the car, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. You're home early. How was the meeting? Fine. Jonathan forced himself to keep his voice neutral. How's my mother? Resting. She had a difficult night. Confusion, tremors, the usual. Victoria stepped closer and kissed his cheek. I've been worried about her. The symptoms seem to be accelerating. Jonathan felt ice form in his stomach. Accelerating, because you increased the dosage. Can I see her? Of course. But she might not recognize you right away. You know how she gets after bad nights. Jonathan walked past Victoria without responding. He could feel her eyes on his back as he climbed the stairs. Margaret was sitting in her wheelchair by the window when he entered her room. She turned at the sound of the door, and Jonathan braced himself for the blank confusion he had grown accustomed to seeing in her eyes. Instead, she looked at him with perfect clarity. Jonathan? He stopped in the doorway. Mom, close the door, quickly. He did as she asked, his heart pounding. Margaret's hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. I haven't taken the pills for 2 days. I've been hiding them. My head is starting to clear. Jonathan felt the room spin. You know, I know something is wrong. I've known for months, but I couldn't hold on to the thought. It kept slipping away. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The pills, Jonathan. The pills she gives me, they're what's making me sick. Grace came to see me today. Margaret's face transformed. Grace, she's alive. She's okay. She's fine. She showed me evidence. Victoria has been... His voice broke. Mom, Victoria has been poisoning you. Margaret reached for his hand. I know, sweetheart. I figured it out 2 nights ago during one of my clear moments. That's why I stopped taking the pills. Why didn't you tell me? Because you wouldn't have believed me. You would have thought it was the confusion talking. You would have told Victoria, and she would have increased the dosage until I couldn't think at all. Margaret squeezed his hand. I needed to wait. I needed you to see the truth for yourself. Jonathan sank into the chair beside her bed, his head in his hands. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I fired Grace. I'm sorry I trusted... Stop. Margaret's voice was firm, commanding. For a moment, she sounded exactly like the judge she used to be. We don't have time for apologies. Victoria will notice something is different if I keep getting better. We need to act now. What do you want me to do? Get me out of this house. Take me to a hospital. Get doctors who aren't under Victoria's influence to examine me. And then call the police. Jonathan looked at his mother, really looked at her for the first time in months. She was thin, pale, weakened by months of poisoning. But her eyes were sharp. Her mind was working. The woman he remembered was still in there fighting to survive. Okay, he said. I'll get you out tonight. Not tonight. Victoria will be watching. She always watches. Margaret thought for a moment. Tomorrow morning. Early. You'll tell her you have a business meeting. I'll pretend to be asleep. You come back for me when she's distracted and we leave together. What if she suspects something? Margaret's jaw tightened. Then we deal with that when it happens. But I am not spending another day in this house as her prisoner. Not one more day, Jonathan. Do you understand? He nodded slowly. I understand. Good. Now go downstairs and act normal. Smile at her. Kiss her goodnight. Don't let her see anything has changed. Jonathan stood, but he didn't move toward the door. How do you do it? How do you stay calm knowing what she's been doing to you? Margaret looked out the window at the darkening sky. Because anger is a luxury I can't afford right now. Because every ounce of energy I have needs to go toward surviving. She turned back to him. And because I spent 30 years as a judge reading people who thought they were smarter than me. Victoria Langley is clever, but she's not as clever as she thinks. That night, Jonathan lay awake beside Victoria staring at the ceiling. She slept peacefully, her breathing slow, and even her face relaxed into an expression of perfect innocence. Looking at her, you would never guess what she was capable of. You would see exactly what she wanted you to see, a beautiful, devoted woman who had sacrificed everything for the man she loved. The lie was so complete it was almost artistic. Jonathan thought about all the times she had comforted him when his mother had a bad day. All the times she had reassured him that the doctors were doing everything they could. All the times she had squeezed his hand and promised that she would be there no matter what happened. Every word had been calculated, every gesture designed to deepen his trust while she slowly murdered his mother. He wanted to wrap his hands around her throat. He wanted to scream the truth in her face and watch her expression crack. But he didn't move, didn't react, didn't let any of the rage churning inside him reach the surface. Tomorrow. Tomorrow he would get his mother to safety. Tomorrow he would expose Victoria for what she truly was. Tonight, he would play the role of the oblivious fiancé one last time. The next morning began like any other. Jonathan dressed for work, kissed Victoria on the cheek, and told her he had an early meeting downtown. She smiled and wished him luck, her hand lingering on his arm just a moment too long. I'll take care of your mother, she said sweetly. "Don't worry about anything." "I know you will," Jonathan replied. The words tasted like acid in his mouth. He drove out of the estate, circled the block, and parked on a side street where he could watch the gates without being seen. At 8:15, the gardening truck arrived, the weekly landscaping crew that Victoria had scheduled months ago. While they worked on the grounds, Victoria would be distracted supervising them the way she supervised everything. This was his window. Jonathan drove back to the mansion and entered through the service entrance using the key Grace had told him about. The halls were quiet. He moved quickly, his heart pounding, until he reached his mother's room. Margaret was dressed and waiting in her wheelchair. She had packed a small bag with nothing but essentials, medication bottles, her identification, a single photograph of Jonathan's father. "Ready," he whispered. "For months," she replied. They made it to the service entrance without encountering anyone. Jonathan helped his mother into the car, folded her wheelchair into the trunk, and pulled away from the mansion just as Victoria emerged from the side garden to check on the landscapers. She never saw them leave. The hospital was 15 minutes away. Jonathan drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Beside him, Margaret breathed slowly, deliberately, as if every breath was a victory. "You did good," she said quietly. "You trusted yourself. That's not easy when someone has been manipulating you." "I should have trusted you. I should have trusted Grace." "You're trusting them now. That's what matters." At the hospital, Jonathan demanded to see a doctor who had no connection to Victoria's chosen physicians. He explained the situation, the suspected poisoning, the gradual decline, the hidden medication. The medical staff listened with professional skepticism that slowly transformed into concern as they examined Margaret and reviewed the contents of the metal box. Blood samples were drawn. Tests were ordered. Margaret was admitted for observation while they waited for results. 3 hours later, the toxicologist called Jonathan into a private office. "Your mother has dangerous levels of sedatives in her bloodstream," the doctor said bluntly. "These levels are consistent with repeated deliberate administration over an extended period. This is not accidental. This is not a medication error. Someone has been systematically poisoning her." Jonathan felt the words land like physical blows. Even though he had known, even though he had seen the evidence himself, hearing it confirmed by a medical professional made it horribly, permanently real. Will she recover? If the poisoning stops completely, yes. Her body will clear the toxins over time. There may be some residual effects, confusion, memory issues, but those should improve significantly once she's no longer being exposed to the sedatives. How long until she's herself again? The doctor hesitated. "It's hard to say. Weeks probably, maybe months. The important thing is that we caught this in time. Another few weeks at those dosage levels, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Jonathan closed his eyes. Another few weeks. Victoria had come that close to succeeding. "What do I do now?" "Now you call the police," the doctor said. "Because what's happened to your mother is attempted murder." The call to the police was the hardest thing Jonathan had ever done. He sat in a hospital waiting room and explained everything. The firing of Grace, the evidence she had gathered, the blood work confirming the poisoning. The detective on the other end listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions in a flat, professional voice. "We'll send officers to your residence within the hour," the detective said finally. "Do you know if Ms. Langley is currently at home?" "She should be. She doesn't leave the house much." "Good. Stay where you are, Mr. Sterling. Don't contact her. Don't warn her. We'll handle this." Jonathan hung up and stared at the phone in his hand. In less than an hour, police officers would arrive at the mansion. They would arrest Victoria. They would search her room and find whatever else she had hidden. They would put her in handcuffs and take her away. And the woman he had planned to marry would become the woman who tried to murder his mother. He should have felt satisfaction. Justice. Relief. Instead, he felt hollow. Empty. Like someone had scooped out his insides and left nothing but a shell. How had he been so blind? How had he let someone deceive him so completely? The questions had no answers. Not yet. Maybe not ever. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a text from the detective. Suspect in custody. Property is secure. We need you to come to the station to give a formal statement. He read the message 3 times, waiting for something to change. Waiting for the relief to come. It didn't. He walked back to his mother's room. She was sleeping now, her face peaceful for the first time in months. The monitors beside her bed showed steady heartbeat, normal blood pressure, stable vital signs. Jonathan sat in the chair beside her bed and took her hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry it took me this long." Margaret's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him with the clarity that had been missing for so many months. "Did they arrest her?" "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes again, but she was smiling. A small, tired smile that carried 7 months of pain and fear and rage. "Good," she said softly. "Then it's finally over." But Jonathan knew it wasn't over. Not really. The trial would come. The media would descend. The questions would multiply. And somewhere at the center of all of it, one truth would remain. A maid had seen what a billionaire couldn't. A woman with nothing had saved a woman with everything. Grace Thompson had been right all along, and he had thrown her out like garbage. That night, Jonathan made one more phone call. The number Grace had given him. Helen answered on the second ring. "This is Jonathan Sterling. I need to speak with Grace." A pause. Shuffling. Then Grace's voice, cautious and measured. "Mr. Sterling. Victoria has been arrested. The blood work confirmed everything. My mother is going to be okay." Silence on the other end of the line. "Grace, are you there?" "I'm here." Her voice was thick with emotion. I didn't know if you would believe me." "I didn't believe you, not at first. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you, for what I said, for not listening when you tried to tell me the truth. You're listening now. That's what matters." Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes. "I want to make this right. I don't know how, but I want to try." "We can talk about that later. Right now, the only thing that matters is Margaret. Is she really going to be okay?" "The doctors say yes. The toxins are already clearing from her system. She recognized me today, Grace. She looked at me, and she knew exactly who I was." Grace laughed, a wet, broken sound that was half sob and half relief. "Thank God. Thank God." "Will you come see her tomorrow if you can? She's been asking for you." Another pause. "She has?" "She said your name was the first clear thought she had when the fog started lifting. She said she needed to thank you." Grace was crying now. Jonathan could hear it in her breathing. "I'll be there," she said finally. "Tell her I'll be there." Jonathan hung up and looked out the window at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, Victoria Langley was sitting in a holding cell, her perfect life crumbling around her. Somewhere out there, the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. And somewhere out there, a woman who had lost everything. Her job, her security, her dignity, was getting ready to visit the person she had risked it all to save. Jonathan didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how to repair the damage he had caused, or how to live with the guilt of what he had almost allowed to happen. But he knew one thing for certain: he would never ignore the truth again. No matter who was speaking it. Grace arrived at the hospital the next morning with trembling hands and a heart full of emotions she couldn't name. She had spent the entire night awake replaying Jonathan's phone call in her mind. Victoria arrested, Margaret recovering. Everything Grace had fought for finally coming true. But the victory felt strange, hollow in places she hadn't expected. 7 months of fear and frustration and helplessness didn't dissolve overnight. They lingered like bruises beneath the skin, invisible but tender to the touch. The nurse at the reception desk directed her to Margaret's room on the 4th floor. Grace walked slowly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. She wasn't sure what she would find. Wasn't sure if Margaret would even remember her clearly. But when she pushed open the door, Margaret was sitting upright in bed, her eyes bright and focused. The moment she saw Grace, her face transformed. Grace. The word came out like a prayer, like something Margaret had been holding on to through months of darkness. Grace crossed the room in 3 steps and took Margaret's outstretched hands. They were still thin, still fragile, but the trembling had stopped. The woman looking back at her was Margaret Sterling, the real Margaret Sterling, not the confused shadow Victoria had created. "You came," Margaret whispered. "You actually came." "I told you I would." "I know. But after everything that happened, after the way Jonathan treated you, I wasn't sure." Grace squeezed her hands gently. "None of that matters now. You're alive. You're getting better. That's all that matters." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You saved my life. Do you understand that if you hadn't kept those records, if you hadn't pushed back when everyone told you to stay quiet, I would be dead by now. Victoria would have won." "She didn't win. She's never going to win. Because of you." Margaret's voice cracked. "Because a woman I treated as an employee cared more about my life than the woman my son planned to marry." Grace didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was she hadn't done anything extraordinary. She had simply paid attention. She had noticed things that others had chosen to ignore. And when the people with power refused to listen, she had kept pushing until someone did. That wasn't heroism. That was just basic human decency. But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, still holding Margaret's hands. "Tell me how you're feeling. Really feeling." Margaret took a deep breath. "Better. Clearer. The fog is lifting a little more each day. Yesterday, I remembered Jonathan's birthday without having to think about it. This morning, I read an entire newspaper article and understood every word." She laughed softly. "It sounds ridiculous, celebrating something so small. But you have no idea how terrifying it was to lose my own mind, to feel myself slipping away and not be able to stop it. I can't imagine. No one can, not unless they've been through it." Margaret's expression darkened. That woman Victoria, she knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't just want to kill me. She wanted to erase me first. Turn me into a shell that everyone would be relieved to see go. But she failed. Yes, because of you. Because you refused to let me disappear. They sat in silence for a moment, 2 women connected by something deeper than words could capture. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice stronger now. "Jonathan told me about the evidence you gathered, the notebook, the medication records. You documented everything for 7 months, Grace." "Why?" Grace considered the question. "Because I knew something was wrong even when I couldn't prove it. And I learned a long time ago that the truth doesn't protect itself. If you want the truth to survive, you have to write it down. You have to make sure it exists somewhere outside your own head, where no one can take it away." "Who taught you that?" "My grandmother. She grew up in Mississippi in the 1940s. She saw things, terrible things that people tried to pretend didn't happen. She always said that the most dangerous lie is the one everyone agrees not to remember." Margaret nodded slowly. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was. She died when I was 23, but I still hear her voice sometimes, especially when I'm scared, especially when it would be easier to stay quiet." Margaret reached up and touched Grace's face. It was a gentle gesture, almost maternal. "I want you to know something," Margaret said. "Whatever happens from here with the trial, with the media, with Jonathan, you will always have a place with me. Not as an employee, as family. Do you understand?" Grace's throat tightened. "I understand." "Good, because I'm not going to let you disappear either." Jonathan found them like that an hour later, sitting together talking quietly, their hands intertwined like old friends reunited after a long separation. He paused in the doorway, uncertain whether to interrupt. Grace looked up and saw him standing there, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The last time they had been in the same room, Jonathan had been ordering her out of his house. He had believed every lie Victoria told him. He had chosen the wrong woman without hesitation. Now he stood before her, with the weight of that choice carved into every line of his face. "Grace," he said quietly, "thank you for coming. I came for your mother, not for you." The words were sharp, but not cruel, just honest. Jonathan nodded. "I deserve that." "Yes, you do." Margaret watched the exchange with careful eyes. "Jonathan, why don't you sit down? We need to talk about what happens next." Jonathan crossed the room and took a seat on the opposite side of the bed. The distance between him and Grace felt deliberate. Neither of them tried to close it. "The police want me to come in this afternoon for a formal statement," Jonathan said. "The detective told me they've found additional evidence at the house. Financial records showing Victoria was moving money into offshore accounts. Communication with someone they're not sure who yet discussing the timeline." "Timeline?" Grace asked. "For my mother's death." Jonathan's voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who was holding himself together through sheer force of will. Apparently, Victoria had been planning this for over a year. She targeted my mother specifically because of our family's wealth. The relationship with me was just a means to an end. Margaret closed her eyes. "I knew there was something wrong with her, from the beginning, but I didn't trust my own instincts." "Neither did I." Jonathan's voice cracked. "I thought I was being paranoid. I thought I was looking for reasons to distrust someone who had only shown me kindness." "She was good at what she did," Grace said quietly. "Predators always are." Jonathan looked at her. "How did you see through it, when I couldn't—" Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because I wasn't blinded by love. Because I had nothing to gain from believing her lies. And because I've spent my whole life being invisible to people like her, which meant she never bothered to hide herself from me." Jonathan flinched at the words. "People like her. Rich, powerful, used to being believed." Grace met his eyes steadily. "Victoria looked right through me every day for 18 months. She thought I was furniture. She never imagined that the furniture was watching." The silence that followed was heavy with truth. Finally, Margaret spoke. "What's going to happen to her at the trial?" Jonathan rubbed his forehead. "The prosecutor says the evidence is overwhelming. The toxicology reports, the financial records, the dosage logs in her own handwriting. They're charging her with attempted murder, elder abuse, and financial fraud. If she's convicted on all counts, she could spend the rest of her life in prison." "Good," Margaret said firmly. "She should." "There's something else." Jonathan hesitated. "The media has already picked up the story. It'll be everywhere by tomorrow. Headlines, news coverage, social media. Our family name is going to be dragged through everything." "I don't care about the family name," Margaret replied. "I care about justice." "So do I. But they're also going to find out about Grace, about how she was fired, about how she tried to warn us, and we didn't listen." Jonathan looked at Grace. "If you want to stay anonymous, I can try to keep your name out of it, but I can't guarantee anything." Grace thought about it. Her name, her face, plastered across news reports and tabloid websites. The attention, the scrutiny, the invasion of the quiet life she had tried so hard to protect. "Let them know," she said finally. Jonathan blinked. "Are you sure? People need to hear this story. Not the dramatic parts, the arrests and the poison and the billionaire family. They need to hear that a maid saw something wrong and nobody listened. They need to understand how easy it is to dismiss someone just because they're not important enough to take seriously." "You were important," Jonathan said quietly. "I was just too blind to see it." "Then make sure the world sees it now." The trial began 6 weeks later. Grace had expected to be nervous. Instead, she felt strangely calm as she walked into the courthouse, Helen at her side. The hallways were crowded with reporters, cameras, spectators who had come to witness the downfall of Victoria Langley. Grace ignored them all. She had one job today: tell the truth. Everything else was noise. The prosecutor had prepared her extensively. They had reviewed her documentation, rehearsed her testimony, anticipated every possible attack the defense might launch. Grace had listened carefully and answered every question honestly. "Just tell them what you saw," the prosecutor had advised. "What you documented, what you did. The evidence speaks for itself." Now, sitting on the witness stand, Grace looked out at the crowded courtroom and felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes pressing down on her. Victoria sat at the defense table, dressed in a conservative gray suit, her hair pulled back, her expression carefully neutral. She looked exactly like what she wanted the jury to see, a respectable woman caught up in a terrible misunderstanding. But Grace knew better. She had seen behind that mask. She had watched Victoria pour poison with steady hands and smile while Margaret suffered. The defense attorney approached first. "Mrs. Thompson, you worked as a housekeeper for the Sterling family for 7 years. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And during that time you were responsible for cleaning laundry and general household maintenance?" "Yes." "But you have no medical training. Is that correct?" Grace kept her voice steady. "I was a nurse's aide for 12 years before I joined the Sterling household. I worked primarily with elderly patients, many of whom had dementia or other cognitive conditions." The attorney's expression flickered with annoyance. He hadn't expected her to push back so quickly. "But you're not a registered nurse. You're not a doctor. You have no formal credentials that would qualify you to assess someone's medical condition." "That's correct. I never claimed to be qualified to diagnose anything." "Yet you took it upon yourself to document Mrs. Sterling's symptoms for 7 months. You made judgments about her medication. You accused my client of poisoning her." "I documented what I observed. I reported my concerns to Mr. Sterling and to Mrs. Langley. My concerns were ignored, so I continued documenting." "And you never went to the police? Never contacted a doctor directly?" "I tried to speak with the home health aide before Ms. Langley had her dismissed. I tried to speak with the visiting nurse before Ms. Langley canceled her visits. Every avenue I attempted was blocked by your client." The attorney's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it true that you were fired from the Sterling household for aggressive behavior toward Mrs. Sterling?" "That's what Ms. Langley claimed. It was a lie." "The night you were terminated, Mr. Sterling himself witnessed you handling his mother roughly. He made the decision to fire you based on what he saw with his own eyes." "Mr. Sterling saw what Mrs. Langley wanted him to see. His mother was choking on medication. I was trying to help her. Ms. Langley reframed the situation to make me look dangerous." "So you're saying my client manipulated a billionaire into firing his loyal employee as part of an elaborate murder scheme?" Grace looked directly at Victoria. For the first time, she saw something crack behind those carefully composed features. A flicker of fear. A hint of the predator recognizing that the prey had teeth. "I'm saying your client is a murderer who got caught, and no amount of expensive legal maneuvering is going to change that." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel. The defense attorney demanded the statement be stricken from the record. But Grace had said what she needed to say. The jury had heard it. And from the expressions on their faces, they believed her. The prosecution's case took 3 weeks to present. Medical experts testified about the toxic levels found in Margaret's blood. Forensic accountants detailed the financial transfers Victoria had made in the months leading up to her arrest. Security footage from the mansion showed Victoria accessing the medication cabinet at odd hours, moving with the deliberate precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source, Margaret Sterling herself. She entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, still fragile but unmistakably present. Her eyes swept the room until they found Victoria, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the war that had been waged for 7 months. "Mrs. Sterling," the prosecutor began gently, "can you describe your relationship with the defendant prior to your illness?" Margaret's voice was soft but clear. "She was my son's fiancée. I welcomed her into my home. I trusted her to help care for me when my health began to decline." "And when did you first notice something was wrong?" "I couldn't pinpoint it at the time. Everything was foggy, confused. I knew I was getting worse, but I couldn't understand why." Margaret paused. "The clearest memory I have from that period is Grace, our housekeeper. She would look at me with such concern, such worry. I knew she saw something I couldn't see myself." "Did Ms. Langley ever behave in a way that made you suspicious?" "Not directly. She was always kind, always attentive. But there were moments, brief flashes of clarity when I would catch her watching me, and there was something in her eyes that didn't match her words." "Can you describe that look?" Margaret's gaze shifted to Victoria. "Patience. She was watching me die, and she was patient, like someone waiting for fruit to ripen." The courtroom was silent. Even the defense attorney didn't object. "What made you finally realize what was happening?" the prosecutor asked. "I stopped taking the pills. 2 days before Jonathan rescued me, I hid them instead of swallowing them, and the fog started to lift." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "That's when I understood. The medication wasn't helping me, it was killing me. And the only person who had access to my medication was the woman my son trusted with my life." "Is that woman in this courtroom today?" Margaret looked directly at Victoria. "Yes, she's sitting right there. And she tried to murder me." Victoria's composure finally cracked. Her face went pale. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. But she didn't speak. What could she possibly say? The defense presented its case over the following week. Character witnesses testified about Victoria's generosity, her dedication, her loving nature. Medical experts raised questions about the accuracy of toxicology testing. The defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Victoria had been set up by a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Grace listened to all of it from the gallery. She watched the jury's faces as the defense tried to weave doubt into the overwhelming mountain of evidence. She saw them struggle, saw them weigh the competing narratives, saw the human tendency to seek easy explanations, to believe that someone so beautiful and composed couldn't possibly be capable of something so monstrous. But she also saw them keep coming back to the facts, the toxicology reports, the financial records, the dosage logs in Victoria's own handwriting. Facts were stubborn things. They didn't care about character witnesses or alternative theories. They simply existed, waiting to be acknowledged. On the final day of testimony, Victoria took the stand in her own defense. It was a risk. Everyone knew it was a risk. But her attorney had apparently decided that the jury needed to hear from Victoria herself, needed to see the woman behind the accusations. "Ms. Langley," her attorney began, "did you poison Margaret Sterling?" "No." Victoria's voice was calm, sincere. "I loved Margaret. I would never hurt her." "Then how do you explain the toxicology findings?" "I can't explain them. I can only tell you that I gave Margaret exactly what her doctors prescribed. Nothing more, nothing less." "And the dosage logs found in your possession?" "Those were my personal notes. I tracked her medication to make sure I never made mistakes. The numbers reflect what she was supposed to receive, not some secret poisoning scheme." "What about the financial transfers to offshore accounts?" "I was protecting myself. Jonathan and I weren't married yet. I wanted security in case things didn't work out. That's not a crime." The prosecutor approached for cross-examination, his expression sharp. "Ms. Langley, you testified that you gave Mrs. Sterling exactly what her doctors prescribed. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Then why did the blood tests show sedative levels 3 times higher than any prescription would produce?" Victoria hesitated. I don't know. There must have been an error somewhere. An error. In the blood tests conducted by 3 different laboratories. Mistakes happen. You also testified that the dosage logs were simply tracking records. But your own handwriting shows calculations, dosage increases tied to specific dates. Dates that correspond exactly with Mrs. Sterling's worst symptom episodes. Victoria's composure flickered. I was trying to help her. Sometimes I had to give her extra medication to help her sleep. Extra medication. That you obtained how? I spoke with her doctor. Her doctor has no record of authorizing increased doses. Would you like to explain that discrepancy? Victoria's hands clenched in her lap. I don't remember exactly. It was months ago. Ms. Langley, is it true that you had a phone conversation on the night before your arrest in which you told someone, and I quote, "She won't last much longer at this rate. When she's gone, everything becomes simpler." The color drained from Victoria's face. That's taken out of context. What context would make those words innocent? Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time, the mask was completely gone. What remained was something small and desperate and terrified. No further questions, the prosecutor said quietly. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Grace sat in the gallery with Helen on one side and Jonathan on the other. Margaret had been wheeled in despite her doctor's concerns. She refused to miss the verdict. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, Grace felt her heart stop. The forewoman stood a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a determined expression. On the count of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. On the count of elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty. Margaret reached for Grace's hand and squeezed it tightly. On the count of financial fraud, we find the defendant guilty. Victoria sat motionless at the defense table. Her attorney whispered something to her, but she didn't respond, didn't react. She simply stared straight ahead as if she couldn't process what was happening. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for the following month. Then, he adjourned the court. Grace stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. 7 months of documentation. Weeks of investigation. A trial that had consumed everything. And now, it was over. Victoria was led away in handcuffs. She passed Grace on her way out of the courtroom, and for a moment, their eyes met. Grace expected to see hatred, contempt, the same dismissive superiority Victoria had always shown her. Instead, she saw nothing. Victoria's eyes were empty, hollow, the eyes of someone who had lost everything and couldn't understand how it had happened. Grace didn't speak. Neither did Victoria. Some things didn't need words. Outside the courthouse, the media descended. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones were thrust toward Jonathan and Margaret and Grace, everyone demanding a statement, a reaction, a soundbite for the evening news. Jonathan held up his hand. We'll have a statement tomorrow. Right now, my family needs time to process this. Mrs. Thompson. A reporter pushed forward. How does it feel to have your story vindicated? What would you say to other workers who suspect something wrong in their workplace? Grace looked at the reporter, looked at the cameras, looked at the crowd of faces waiting for her response. I would tell them to trust what they see, she said quietly. Document everything. Don't let anyone convince you that your observations don't matter just because of who you are. The truth doesn't care about your job title or your bank account. It only cares about being told. Do you feel like a hero? Grace almost laughed at the question. No. I feel like a woman who did what anyone should do when they see something wrong. I'm not special. I just refuse to look away. Margaret's wheelchair was pushed through the crowd by a hospital aide. She reached out and grasped Grace's hand. She's wrong about one thing, Margaret said loudly enough for the reporters to hear. She is special. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure the world knows it. The cameras captured the moment. Two women holding hands. One wealthy and white, weakened by months of poison but unbowed. One black and working class, exhausted but triumphant. It wasn't a perfect picture. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. But it was real. And sometimes real was better than perfect. That night, Jonathan drove Grace back to Helen's house. They rode in silence for most of the journey, the weight of the day pressing down on both of them. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "I owe you an apology, a real one, not just words, actions." "You don't owe me anything," Grace replied. "You did the right thing when it mattered. I did the right thing after I almost let my mother die. After I threw out the one person who was actually protecting her. That's not something I can forgive myself for easily." "Then don't forgive yourself easily. Live with it. Learn from it. Do better." Jonathan glanced at her. "You're not going to let me off the hook, are you?" "No, because letting you off the hook wouldn't help either of us." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." They pulled up in front of Helen's small house. Grace reached for the door handle, then paused. "Your mother asked me to come back," she said. "To work for the family again." Jonathan's eyebrows rose. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd think about it." "And what are you thinking?" Grace turned to look at him. "I'm thinking that I spent 7 years in that house watching your family live a life I could never have. I cooked your food, cleaned your rooms, washed your clothes. And when I tried to tell you the truth, you threw me out without a second thought." Jonathan flinched, but didn't interrupt. "I'm not angry anymore," Grace continued. "But I'm not the same person I was before. I can't just go back to being invisible in your hallways pretending everything is normal." "What would it take for you to consider coming back?" Grace thought about it. Really thought about it. "I want a seat at the table," she said finally. "Not literally. I don't need to eat dinner with you. But when decisions are made about your mother's care about the household, about anything that affects the people who work there, I want my voice to matter. I want to be heard, not just tolerated." "That's reasonable." "And I want you to fund a program, something for domestic workers and caregivers, legal support, advocacy, education. People like me shouldn't have to fight alone when they see something wrong." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll do it, all of it. Not because I owe you, although I do, but because it's the right thing." Grace studied his face, looking for the sincerity behind the words. She found it. "Then I'll think about coming back. That's all I can ask." Grace opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air. Before she closed it, she leaned back in. "Jonathan, yes. Your mother is going to be okay. She's stronger than you think. Stronger than any of us knew." Jonathan's eyes glistened. "I know. Thanks to you." Grace closed the door and walked toward Helen's house without looking back. Inside, Helen was waiting with 2 cups of tea and a tired smile. "It's done?" she asked. "It's done." Grace sank into the worn armchair that had become her refuge over the past weeks. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. Her bones ached. Her heart ached. Everything ached. But beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred. Something that felt like peace. "You did good, Grace," Helen said quietly. "You should be proud." "I'll be proud tomorrow. Tonight I just want to sleep." Helen laughed softly. "Then sleep. The world will still be there in the morning." Grace closed her eyes and let the silence wash over her. 7 months of fighting. 7 months of being ignored, dismissed, silenced. 7 months of watching a woman she loved fade away and feeling powerless to stop it. Now it was over. Margaret was safe. Victoria was going to prison. The truth had finally won. Grace didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who had done what needed to be done and survived the cost. That was enough. That had to be enough. Tomorrow she would start figuring out what came next. Tomorrow, she would make decisions about her future, about Jonathan's offer, about the life she wanted to build from the ashes of everything she had lost. But tonight, she just needed to rest. She had earned that much. 6 months passed like water through open fingers. The headlines faded. The cameras moved on to newer scandals, fresher tragedies, more sensational stories. The world had a short attention span for justice. It consumed the drama of Victoria Langley's conviction like fast food, then forgot about it by the following news cycle. But for Grace Thompson, nothing faded. Everything that had happened remained vivid present, woven into the fabric of her daily life, like threads that couldn't be removed. She had accepted Jonathan's offer eventually. Not to return as a housekeeper, that chapter was closed, but to help build something new. The Margaret Sterling Foundation launched quietly on a Tuesday morning in March, operating from a small office above a bakery on 5th Street. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press releases, just Grace Helen, 2 part-time staff members, and a mission statement typed on a single sheet of paper. Every voice deserves to be heard. The work was harder than Grace had anticipated. Domestic workers came to them with stories that echoed her own abuse. Witnessed concerns dismissed jobs lost for speaking up. Elderly patients whose families didn't believe them. Caregivers accused of theft or violence when they tried to report mistreatment. The same patterns repeated endlessly, invisible threads connecting thousands of quiet tragedies across the city. Grace listened to each one. She documented, she advocated. She pushed back against systems designed to silence people like her. Some days she wondered if any of it made a difference. On those days, she called Margaret. "You're changing things," Margaret would tell her, her voice stronger, now clearer. "You can't see it because you're too close, but I see it. Jonathan sees it. The people you help see it. I just feel like I'm fighting the same battle over and over." That's what justice looks like, Grace. It's not one big victory. It's 1,000 small ones day after day until the world shifts just a little bit more toward fairness. Grace would hang up feeling slightly better. Slightly. The doubt never fully disappeared, but she learned to work alongside it. Doubt was just another companion on the road, like exhaustion and frustration and the occasional flicker of hope. Margaret's recovery continued steadily through the spring and into summer. The doctors had warned that some cognitive effects might be permanent. 7 months of poisoning had taken a toll that couldn't be fully reversed. But Margaret defied their cautious predictions with the same stubborn determination that had defined her career on the bench. She walked without assistance by April. She resumed reading legal journals by May. By June, she was attending foundation board meetings and offering pointed critiques of their operating procedures with the sharp tongue Grace remembered from years ago. "Your intake forms are too complicated," Margaret announced during one meeting, waving a stack of papers in the air. "You're asking people who are already traumatized to fill out 17 pages of documentation before they can get help. That's not advocacy. That's bureaucracy." Grace exchanged a look with Helen. "We designed those forms based on legal requirements." Then change the legal requirements, or find workarounds. The point is to help people, not to create filing systems. Jonathan, sitting quietly in the corner, smiled. "She's right, you know." "Of course I'm right," Margaret snapped. "I didn't spend 30 years as a judge without learning how paperwork kills good intentions." The forms were simplified by the following week. The relationship between Grace and Jonathan remained complicated. They weren't friends exactly. The wound from her firing had scarred over but never fully healed. Sometimes Grace caught herself watching him during meetings, remembering the coldness in his eyes when he had ordered her out of his house, remembering the way he had chosen Victoria's word over hers without hesitation. He had apologized. Multiple times. He had funded the foundation, supported her work, treated her with respect and deference that bordered on excessive. But trust once broken took time to rebuild. And Grace wasn't sure she wanted to rebuild it. Some distances were meant to be maintained. One afternoon in July, Jonathan found her alone in the foundation office, reviewing case files at her desk. "Can I ask you something?" he said, hovering in the doorway. Grace looked up. "You're going to ask anyway. Do you hate me?" The question caught her off guard. She set down her pen and considered it honestly. "No, I don't hate you. But you don't forgive me either." Forgiveness isn't a light switch, Jonathan. You can't just flip it and expect everything to be bright again. Grace leaned back in her chair. "I understand why you did what you did. Victoria was convincing. She played you perfectly. If I had been in your position, maybe I would have made the same choices. But you were in a position of power, and you used that power to silence someone who was trying to tell you the truth. That's not something I can just forget, because you feel bad about it now." Jonathan absorbed this quietly. "So what do? We keep working. We keep building this foundation. We keep helping people." Grace met his eyes. "And maybe eventually actions will accomplish what apologies can't. Is that enough for you?" Grace thought about it. "I don't know yet. Ask me again in a few years." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Grace, you're the most remarkable person I've ever met, and I'm grateful every day that you didn't give up, even when I gave you every reason to." Grace didn't respond. She simply watched him go, then returned to her work. Some things didn't need acknowledgement. They just needed to exist. Victoria Langley was sentenced to 42 years in prison. Grace didn't attend the sentencing hearing. She had said everything she needed to say during the trial, and she had no desire to watch Victoria's face as the judge pronounced her fate. That chapter was closed. Reopening it would only keep old wounds fresh. But Margaret attended. She insisted on it. "I need to see it end," she explained to Grace the night before. "I need to watch her hear those words and know that she'll never hurt anyone again." "Will that give you closure?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I don't believe in closure. I believe in moving forward, but sometimes you need to look back one last time before you can do that." After the sentencing, Margaret called Grace from the courthouse steps. "It's done," she said. Her voice was steady, but Grace could hear the exhaustion beneath it. 42 years. She'll be nearly 80 when she's eligible for parole. "How do you feel?" A long pause. "Empty. I expected to feel satisfied, vindicated. Instead, I just feel tired." "That's normal. Justice doesn't always feel the way we expect it to." "No, it doesn't." Margaret took a breath. "But I'm ready to stop thinking about her now. I'm ready to focus on what comes next instead of what already happened." "That sounds healthy." "It sounds exhausting. But I'm going to try anyway." Grace laughed softly. "Let me know if you need help." "I always need help, Grace. That's what family is for." The word landed differently now. Family. Margaret had used it before, but this time it carried weight. Meaning. A recognition of everything they had survived together and everything they would build from the wreckage. "I'll be there," Grace said. "I know you will. You always are." Autumn arrived with golden leaves and cooler temperatures, and Grace found herself settling into a rhythm she hadn't expected. She woke each morning at 6, made coffee, reviewed case files until 8, then drove to the foundation office where Helen and the staff were already working. The days were long and often frustrating, filled with setbacks and bureaucratic obstacles and cases that couldn't be won no matter how hard they tried. But there were victories too, small ones, mostly a caregiver reinstated after wrongful termination, an elderly patient moved to safer care, a family reunited after a worker's advocacy broke through months of institutional resistance. Each victory reminded Grace why she had started this work in the first place. Not for recognition, not for redemption. Simply because someone had to do it, and she had learned the hard way that waiting for others to act was a luxury the vulnerable couldn't afford. Helen noticed the change in her. "You're different lately," she observed one evening as they closed up the office. "Different how?" "More settled. less angry. Helen studied her face. When you first came to my kitchen that night, you were carrying so much weight. I could see it crushing you. But now I don't know. Something shifted. Grace considered this. I spent 7 months feeling powerless, watching Margaret suffer and not being able to stop it. That kind of helplessness changes you. It burrows inside and makes a home. And now I'm not helpless anymore. I have work that matters, people who need me, a purpose beyond just surviving. Grace smiled faintly. It doesn't erase what happened, but it gives me somewhere to put all that energy besides anger. Helen nodded. That's called healing, Grace. Is it? I always thought healing meant forgetting. No, healing means learning to carry the memory without letting it break you. Helen touched her arm gently. You're doing that, better than most people could. Grace didn't know how to respond, so she simply said thank you and let the conversation end. But she thought about Helen's words for a long time afterward. Healing. She had never used that word to describe what was happening inside her. But maybe it fit. Maybe it was the right name for this slow, gradual process of becoming someone new, without abandoning who she had been. On the 1-year anniversary of Victoria's arrest, Margaret invited Grace and Jonathan to dinner. It was a quiet affair, just the 3 of them, in Margaret's new home, a smaller house she had chosen specifically because it had nothing in common with the mansion where she had almost died. The meal was simple. The conversation was easy. No one mentioned Victoria's name. After dinner, Margaret poured 3 glasses of wine and led them to the garden she had been cultivating since her recovery. I planted these roses the week after the trial ended, she said, gesturing to a row of deep red blooms. The gardener told me they wouldn't survive the winter, that I was planting them too late in the season. They look healthy to me, Grace observed. They are, because I refused to listen to someone who told me what was impossible. Margaret smiled. That's become something of a theme in my life lately. Jonathan raised his glass. To impossible things. To the people who believe in them, Grace added. They drank in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I've been thinking about the future, Margaret said eventually. About what I want the next chapter of my life to look like. And, Jonathan asked, I want to teach. Not full-time, I don't have the energy for that anymore. But guest lectures maybe. Mentoring young lawyers, sharing what I've learned. She turned to Grace. Including what I learned from you. Grace blinked. From me? You taught me that truth doesn't care about credentials. That a woman with a mop and a notebook can see things that experts miss. That the most important voice in any room is often the quietest one. Margaret's eyes glistened. I spent 30 years on the bench thinking I understood justice. You showed me I had barely scratched the surface. Grace felt her throat tighten. I didn't teach you anything. I just did what needed to be done. That's exactly this point. You didn't wait for permission. You didn't defer to people with more power or education or status. You saw something wrong, and you fought to make it right, even when everyone told you to stop. Margaret reached out and took her hand. That's what I want to teach. That's the lesson I want to pass on. Grace couldn't speak. For a moment, all she could do was hold Margaret's hand and let the tears fall. A year ago, she had been fired from this family, thrown out like trash, told that her observations didn't matter, that she should stay in her place, that she was nobody. Now she was sitting in a garden with the woman she had saved, being told that her actions had changed how a former judge understood justice. The world was strange, unfair, broken in countless ways. But sometimes in small moments like this one, it was also beautiful. Thank you, Grace finally managed, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for not giving up when I couldn't fight for myself, Margaret replied. We saved each other, Grace. Don't ever forget that. Jonathan cleared his throat. I feel like I should say something meaningful, but you two have covered everything important. Grace laughed, wiping her eyes. You could try. Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for showing me what I was too blind to see. Jonathan set down his wine glass. I spent my whole life thinking that success meant being in control, having all the answers, never being wrong. But I was wrong about everything that mattered. And the two of you, his voice caught. The two of you were right, even when I refused to listen. You're listening now, Margaret said gently. That's what matters. Is it enough? Grace and Margaret exchanged a look. Then Grace spoke. It's a start. Keep listening. Keep learning. Keep using your resources to help people who don't have any. She paused. Do that for the rest of your life, and maybe it'll be enough. Jonathan nodded slowly. I can do that. Good. Then we're all going to be okay. The evening ended with promises to meet again soon, with hugs that lingered longer than expected, with the quiet satisfaction of people who had survived something terrible together and emerged stronger on the other side. Grace drove home through streets lit by street lamps and moonlight. The radio played softly an old song her husband used to love, and for once the memory didn't hurt. It simply existed, a thread connecting her present to her past, reminding her of everyone she had loved and lost along the way. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. 7 years working in a mansion that never felt like home. 7 months watching a woman she cared about fade away. 7 weeks fighting to be believed. And now a year of building something new from the wreckage of everything that had been destroyed. It wasn't the life she had planned. It wasn't the life she had expected. But it was hers. And she was grateful for every difficult, painful, beautiful moment that had led her here. When Grace arrived at her small apartment, she didn't go inside immediately. Instead, she stood on the front steps, looking up at the stars scattered across the night sky. Her grandmother's voice came back to her one last time. When you see wrong happening and you stay quiet, you become part of the wrong. Grace had refused to stay quiet. She had refused to be part of the wrong. And because of that refusal, a woman was alive, a predator was in prison, and a foundation existed to help others fight the same battles she had fought. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no prince, no castle, no happily ever after. There was just this, a woman standing under the stars, tired but unbroken, knowing that she had made a difference. That was enough. That had always been enough. Grace Thompson walked inside, closed the door behind her, and stepped into the rest of her life. Some truths don't need to be loud to be powerful. Some heroes don't need capes or titles or recognition. Some victories come not with fanfare, but with silence. The silence of a woman who refused to look away, who documented what she saw, who spoke when no one would listen, and who kept speaking until the world finally heard. This is the story of Grace Thompson, a maid, a witness, a fighter, and the living proof that one voice raised at the right moment can save a life. Remember her name. Remember what she did. And the next time you see something wrong, the next time someone tells you to stay quiet, to know your place, to leave it to the experts, remember that the truth doesn't care about your job title or your bank account or how much power you hold. The truth only cares about being told. So tell it, even when it costs you everything, especially then.